In this module, we are going to discuss different types of boundaries as well as different types of boundary violations. And then we're going to go into boundaries in each of the 7 areas of life, okay? So, first and foremost, there are different types of boundaries that you want to be aware of, okay? Our first type of boundary are our mental boundaries. So, our mental boundaries are going to be like our thoughts, our beliefs, our personal opinions and ideas. And a violation to this boundary might be like somebody enforcing their ideas on you or telling you what you can or cannot believe, what political ideas you have to identify with or not, and trying to sort of push their opinions on you. And that could be a violation of a mental boundary. An emotional boundary is really where you end and someone else begins emotionally. So it's the difference between, you taking on somebody's feelings as your own, maybe a family member is in an enmeshed dynamic, maybe a friend of yours feeling like, oh my goodness, they're in pain, I need to fix it immediately, and you're sort of feeling all of their pain. Now, there's a big difference between sympathizing and empathizing, and what I notice people do a lot, this is actually something I had to work on as a human being myself, what I notice people can do a lot is you see somebody in pain because you recognize and can personally understand what their pain is like because maybe you went through something similar at a point in your life. You are like, oh, they feel all alone, and you get really concerned about their feelings. But what you're actually doing is you're relating to an unhealed or just a really painful deep experience that you once had within yourself, and you're projecting that they must feel that way as well. And what a really great exercise to do is take a look and take a second before you just project like worst case scenarios onto another person about what you think they're feeling. And basically you're telling a story about their story of their life, and you're suffering over your own version of their story that you've made up in your own mind, right? So what can be really important to do is just make that conscious for a second and ask yourself, like, day to day, how bad are they actually feeling? Because I was speaking to somebody the other day as an analogy, and they were saying that they were really worried about one of their parents, and that the parent was living alone and had been separated, and they were just thinking, oh my goodness, they probably feel so alone all the time. And then when we actually looked and I asked them, what kind of attachment style do you think they are? Are they pretty independent? Do they enjoy their time alone? What this individual realized is like, hey, you know what? They live in a home, a group home where they have community and they can go talk to people when they need to. This person really actually likes their alone time and tends to enjoy it. That was part of what came between them and their partner and their marriage. And what was funny is that the individual who was fearing what their parent was experiencing was very anxiously attached, and their parent themselves was very dismissive avoidant. And so when they actually just made this conscious and took a look, they were able to empathize properly and go, oh, I can see that they're probably feeling a certain degree of pain and I want to be there to support. But it wasn't from a sympathetic place where they were just sort of projecting their own unresolved emotions onto the parent and suffering over that kind of fabricated story of what the person's experiencing. And part of like real empathy is being able to tune into what that person's situation is, knowing what you know about them, and even asking the appropriate questions to get a clearer picture about how that person's feeling, instead of sort of filling in the blanks with sometimes our own projected wounds onto others. So just an important sort of note there about emotional boundaries. Our third boundary are our time boundaries, and this can include how much we think about others or ruminate about a problem. We can be violating our own time boundaries in our thinking, right, or in how much we're taking on other people's emotions. So we can be violating our own time boundaries at an emotional level as well as a mental level, right? But our time boundaries can also have a lot to do with how much we give our time to others when it may not feel like it's a healthy or fair compromise to ourselves. So it is not uncommon for me to see in romantic relationships, for example, that maybe one partner feels like they're always giving the emotional energy to the other partner, and that there's not sort of a two-way exchange, or that one partner is always giving the financial energy to another partner, or all the time they spend making money, it's sort of giving to the partner in the relationship, or even that one person is always giving their time to do duties and chores and activities around the house, and they're not feeling like there's sort of this healthy exchange or this discussion. Now remember, the difference between a sacrifice and a compromise is not how much of anything we're doing. It's how it feels in the relationship to ourselves. So for example, maybe you're the partner in the relationship that does way more chores. But maybe you kind of like cleaning and you enjoy the chores, and it's sort of this like peaceful relaxation or decompression for you. This is something I see quite commonly in men and women. And so if you enjoy that, then that's not going to be like a violation of your time boundaries. But what could be is if you really don't enjoy giving your emotional energy and your partner's always kind of emotionally dumping on you and venting to you about work, and you're like, oh, I have to be listening all the time, I have to be present, and maybe there are things in you that you need to resolve emotionally first, that's when you're going to have a sacrifice. So it's not about like how much of what we're doing, it's about how that thing feels and relates to what we like or don't like in our personal reality, and if we feel like there's a healthy exchange in response. And that exchange in our boundaries between relationships does not have to be in the same form. So you might be giving a lot of your time energy to people with chores around the house and different things you're doing, but maybe your partner is giving a lot of their time energy to you in terms of how they show up for you emotionally. And so as long as you're looking at the full spectrum, and we're going to go through this when we talk about the 7 areas of life and our boundaries, but as long as you are feeling like the boundaries you have are authentic to you, you're considering yourself in the process of how what you're giving to others feels for you, then you're going to be in a healthy space. So make sure you don't fall into the trap of being like, I do so much cleaning around the house, and then feeling resentful about it and telling a story around it when that might be something you actually enjoy doing as well. So look at it from both angles, okay? So far we have our mental boundaries, our emotional boundaries, our time boundaries, and then we have our physical boundaries, okay? This can be our physical space. This can be our physical body, okay? This can be things like what people tell us to wear can be a violation of a boundary. This can be things like, if people show up to our physical space unannounced, that might violate a physical boundary. And then we have our material boundaries. So this can be, if people borrow your items without asking, it could be a boundary violation. If people, material boundaries can include financial, right? So if people are borrowing money and not repaying you or asking for money all the time, these sorts of things can be violations of material boundaries. And then we have our sexual boundaries, which really has to do with what we feel safe and comfortable with in terms of our sexual expression, our sexual connection and intimacy with one another. And if people are invading that in some kind of way, that will feel like a boundary violation in the sexual area. So I want to dig into the types of boundary violations more specifically. So there are 2 sort of types in terms of how others can sort of violate you. And this can be through action violations or non-action violations. Okay, so what does this mean? Well, action violations are essentially someone taking something from you and it violating you, or somebody speaking to you in a certain way and it violates you, or showing up unannounced. These are things that people do through action that create a boundary violation. Okay, so somebody taking something from you could be sort of a physical boundary violation, or material, right? Somebody speaking to you in a certain way could be an emotional boundary violation. Somebody showing up unannounced, right? Could be a time boundary violation. They take your time when they show up, or a physical space boundary violation. You don't want to welcome people into your space without some kind of warning. Somebody touching you inappropriately could be a sexual boundary violation. So these types of boundary violations are going to apply to those different types of boundaries, and they're going to be through things that people do to you or towards you that crosses that imaginary line, okay? Then we have non-action boundary violations. And this is sort of the opposite. This can be things like somebody says they'll do something for you in a relationship and you're expecting it because it's been communicated, and then they don't, okay? Or they say they're going to give you back something that they borrowed and they don't. Or they say, oh, I'm going to come over, and then they don't show up at all, and you planned your day and your time. So these types of things are non-action boundary violations, and both of them hurt in the same way. But without the recognition that they can be, there can be a non-action violation, sometimes we don't realize that a boundary was crossed. So it is extremely important when you're looking at the types of boundary violations that you work on approaching them from both angles, okay? Was this an action boundary violation or a non-action boundary violation? Now, in terms of another component to types of boundary violations, we have self-boundary violations and we have other boundary violations. So self-boundary violations are going to look something like this. Some examples of this could be you stay somewhere too long when you don't want to. Okay, you go to a party or a social event or a family gathering, and maybe you have to be up early the next morning. Or maybe you have like an early bedtime and everybody else likes to stay up later. And you want to leave because that's what's true for you in consideration to yourself. And there isn't a compromise where it's like, oh, but everybody wants me to stay. I'll just stay an extra 15 minutes or half an hour. You just stay until everybody else leaves for 3 hours past when you would want to. There was no compromise, no consideration to self, but ultimately, nobody made you do that through action or inaction. You chose that yourself, which is really a self-boundary violation. So you can think of a self-boundary violation as when we ignore our feelings or needs and say yes to things that are uncomfortable or wrong for us without taking ourselves into consideration. It's that theme again. Do you see? It's the art of considering yourself in the process of making your decisions. Another example of this could be like, you help your friend move all of their things when like you're already really burnt out in your life, or you just moved yesterday, or whatever it might be. So maybe somebody just asked you, hey, would you be open to helping me, but you didn't consider yourself in the process of making that decision. So that's a self-boundary violation. Another boundary violation is when somebody does something unwanted without a conversation or without asking permission. Okay, so they didn't really even leave room for you to make a choice. And sometimes these things can go hand in hand in certain dynamics, but oftentimes they're quite separate. So this can be that somebody just borrowed something from your closet, maybe a family member, without asking at all, and you didn't even find out until later when they came to you and said, oh, by the way, I borrowed your white dress and I spilled red wine all over it, and so you didn't get a chance to make a decision or consider. Okay, so these are the examples of other boundary violations, and these types of boundary violations are always going to occur at either the mental level, emotional level, time level, physical level, material level, or sexual level, okay? So do you see this? There are different types of boundary violations that can take place, okay? Either from ourselves or from others, and they can either from others be action violations or non-action violations, okay? And same within ourselves. And they're always going to occur at one of those 6 levels in terms of the types of boundaries, okay? So in the next part of this module, we're now going to go into the different types of boundaries in the 7 areas of our life. So let's now talk about different boundaries in each of the 7 areas of your life. Okay, so far we've talked about the different types of actual boundaries as well as the types of boundary violations. Now we're going to apply this material to each of the 7 areas of our lives. Okay, so the actual 7 areas of life we're about to go into aren't boundaries, but they're the places that we need to apply our boundaries, check in with our boundaries, and see whether we have boundaries effectively set up or not. So one of the most important things, and we're going to touch on this as well as we go through some of the processes, one of the most important things we can do as individuals when we are working on boundaries, especially if we tend to historically struggle on this area, is set boundaries ahead of time by defining them ahead of time. Because if you don't even know what your boundaries are in many of the 7 areas of life, if not all, and then you're trying to figure out how you're going to set them and improve your relationships and improve your workplace and your financial situation and all these different things, then what's going to happen is you're going to just feel like you're swimming in circles, right? So one of the most important things you can do, and I want you to take a moment and even pause this module as we go through it, is to set intentional boundaries in each of the 7 areas of your life based on the information you have so far. So I'm going to read the different 7 areas of your life out to you, and I want you to do this with me. Pause and ask yourself, go through these exercises. What are my mental boundaries? What are my emotional boundaries, my time boundaries, physical, material, and sexual in each of these 7 areas, okay? So if you look in your workbook, you're going to have something in front of you that has the 7 areas of life, okay? And I want you to take the time to get really clear. So let's start, and I'm going to give you some examples. Let's start with your career area of your life, okay? So in the career area of your life, what are your mental boundaries, your emotional boundaries, time, physical, material, sexual boundaries, okay? So let's just do some examples. In terms of your career, In the mental area, is there anybody in your career life that pushes their ideas on you and you just accept them? Forces you to change your ideas or beliefs or pressures you and you just do it. And tune in, like, it's completely okay to take in new beliefs, to let your beliefs get changed, broken down. In fact, sometimes it's a really beautiful thing. It's like a metamorphosis. But other times, if we aren't actually listening to somebody's ideas, considering our own, maybe even testing or trying those new ideas out and seeing how they work for us or how they sit with us, if we just accept something because somebody tells us that we should be doing it, or we just accept something because somebody tells us we should be believing it, then we violated our own boundaries because that key missing principle is not there. We didn't take ourselves into consideration when making these decisions or choices. So check in, like, are your mental boundaries being violated? Are you violating any of your mental boundaries in a specific area of your life? Okay, or a specific area in your career life. Emotional. Are you taking on other people's stress in the workplace? Are you taking on work and maybe violating some of even your time boundaries because you sense your boss's emotional stress and you're enmeshed a little bit with authority figures or with people around you very easily, and so it's like, oh my gosh, they're in pain, I have to fix their pain to get rid of my own pain, and then you violate your own boundaries in that area. Is somebody violating your emotional boundaries directly? Is it an other boundary violation where somebody's saying mean or rude or cruel or offensive things to you and it's making you feel an emotional pain, and they're not respecting that line, right, of how you could be impacted emotionally by the things they're saying or doing? Are your time boundaries being violated? Are you supposed to be working 40 hours a week, and then every single day, as you're about to leave the office at 5 p.m., a boss or a colleague is like, hey, can you do this for 3 hours tonight? And they're every day, dumping on you in terms of things that affect your time boundaries. And are they doing that and you're not speaking up at the same time? So it's both a self boundary violation and another boundary violation coming together and coalescing. Is there a physical boundary that's being violated in your career? Okay, a physical boundary could be something like you have your office, but people don't knock; they barge in all the time when you're in the middle of working on things, and maybe you're doing something in like coding or web design or something you need to be highly focused in, and it's violating your space all the time. Do people come and leave their belongings in your space where they're not supposed to be? Okay, materially, are people taking from you in your career? So are they taking money? Are they is it a non-action violation where you've been asking for a raise from your boss for 2 years and they keep saying, yeah, we'll do it, we'll definitely give you a raise at the end of this quarter, and then they never do anything and it's been this ongoing process for you? Is it a non-action violation of a boundary from another, right? So take a look at all of this holistically and see what shows up. Is there a sexual boundary violation? Is somebody touching you inappropriately, making comments that make you feel super uncomfortable consistently? And are you showing up and respecting your own boundary, or are you allowing these things to happen because you're like, oh my gosh, this is in my workplace? Obviously, it's not appropriate no matter what. But, where can you do something that's going to change these things? And on a side note, like, if somebody's violating a sexual boundary in your workplace, it should be reported, or you should leave the workplace immediately so that you're safe. But, check into all of these different areas to see, like, what do I need to do materially, physically, in terms of my time, and communicate, so that these things can change immediately. And as you're going through and looking at these different types of boundaries, ask yourself, like, is this something that I want to work on, or is this something that I need to get away from? Because sometimes we have a boundary where it's like, maybe a time boundary. Maybe people come in and chat with you in your office too often throughout the course of your workday, and it's a self violation because you chat with them too, even though it stresses you out and you feel like you need to get work done. Or maybe it's an other violation, and it's a combination of the two, right? People are coming in and chatting with you and not respecting your time for the things you have to get done. So some of these things are like workable. You just want to work through them. Some of them, like, are maybe you need to leave the environment because they're completely inappropriate boundary violations. So check in and try to gauge, like, how strong or what degree of a boundary violation is taking place. Now, what I want you to keep doing as you go through this, so that was just the first example in your career. You want to go through those same things and really assess, like, financially, where are there boundary violations? mentally in my life, emotionally, physically, spiritually, relationships. And so in all of these 7 areas, and there will be a little bit of overlap at times, in your relationships, can be with your friends, your family, your romantic relationships. Try to sit down and go, okay, where are boundaries being violated in any of these areas of my life? Okay. And what you can do is in the column next to it, which you'll see in your workbook, write down what boundary you would like to have there instead. Okay. And I'm going to show you how to do this on a high level, and we're going to go really in depth about doing this later on, like how to really be clear about what that boundary is, how to communicate it, express it, deal with objections, all those different things in a step-by-step format. But first, you just need to have some clarity and get the ball rolling in terms of the introspective piece. So what boundary would you need there instead? What do you need to happen instead in these situations? And in some of the situations for different individuals, and this won't necessarily be for everybody, but every so often, it wouldn't be uncommon that it's like, yeah, let's say my romantic relationship, somebody's constantly calling me really awful names or being mentally, emotionally violent or physically violent. In those cases, like, the boundary is to leave, right? There are certain cases where the boundary is an absolute boundary. And again, we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the course. But be clear, are these boundaries things that I can work through and break through and will evolve me as a person in terms of my growth? Having that tough conversation with my friend and saying, hey, you can't stop by unannounced anymore. Or my coworker, hey, I can't take on your work all the time. Like, I need to have a time boundary for myself. Is it having those conversations and you get to grow and expand as a person? Or in certain conditions, is that you need to set a hard boundary, an absolute boundary, and leave the environment altogether to keep yourself safe, preserved, happy, fulfilled, etc. So in order to do this, we first need to know how, like, when a boundary is being violated. And sometimes we can be so out of touch with our boundaries that we don't even recognize a boundary is violated in real time until after the fact. So how can we work at becoming better at recognizing when a boundary is violated? Number one, you will know a boundary is violated because of the way it makes you feel. Your emotions are this beautiful guidance system, and they're not going to let you down. They are going to be consistently showing up to let you know that something feels bad when it's not working for you. And it's so important to tune into that. And sometimes we have to practice clarifying after the fact. It's very common. And so don't worry if you're at this place in your boundary setting life right now, but it's very common that we can not even know a boundary is violated until we're home from work and we're like, oh my gosh, it actually felt really bad when my coworker talked to me that way in the meeting this morning. Or, oh my gosh, it felt really bad when situation X happened with my partner. It's not uncommon that we don't realize until after. And if that's you, that's okay. This is what this course is for. So that you can work on identifying these things more efficiently and then communicating them more effectively. So if this is you and this is what you're experiencing, something that's going to be really important to do is just start with some of these, like, early little steps, okay? And I'm going to take you through, again, a deeper step-by-step a little bit later on in this course. But check in at the end of your day with how you felt throughout the course of a day. And notice if there were any feelings of resentment, frustration, overwhelm, discomfort, and ask yourself, is it because there was some kind of boundary violated? And tune in, was it in one of the 7 areas of my life? Was it an action violation or a non-action violation? Did that boundary come from me? Like, did I not speak up? I agreed to do something that I didn't really want to do? Or did that boundary come from somebody that didn't really ask permission, request permission, do something towards me that was respectful and fair, that really carved out my boundaries? Now, if people are violating your boundaries, it's up to you to check in with, is this person, this bad person or not? Most of the time, people are not doing these things intentionally. In fact, some of you guys watching this course might recognize just through doing this course, like, oh my gosh, I accidentally violate other people's boundaries all the time without meaning to. Because we're not usually taught boundaries. And those of you who are taught boundaries less in life, and maybe in a meshed family dynamic, and growing up as a whole, you're less likely to be aware of other people's boundaries as well, because there just wasn't a boundary method taught to you. There wasn't a strategy for relating when it came to boundaries growing up. So a lot of times, like, people, if they are violating your boundaries, don't mean to be, But it's up to us to be able to restructure that relationship in a healthy way so that boundaries can be respected in order to thrive and feel really good and fulfilled in the relationships around us. Okay? So if you notice that there's this time in your day where you feel like a boundary is violated, ask yourself, what did I feel when this took place? And what did I need instead of what happened in this situation? And what's a way I could express this? Okay, what would it look like if I express this in a healthy manner? And again, I'm going to take you through some steps to really fine tune that, but that's a really great place to start in terms of just getting the ball rolling in your awareness around boundaries as a whole. And what you can do with this early awareness piece here is you can look in your workbook and you'll see your feelings and your needs list, okay? And I want you to look and see, like, what feelings came up for me when somebody violated a boundary. Again, these might be things like feeling trapped, feeling some kind of sense of discomfort, feeling resentful, frustrated. And then ask yourself, look at the needs list and try to circle, okay, what do I need instead? Now, the needs may or may not be on there. There are endless needs, but the needs list is like the most common tertiary, like moment to moment, day to day type needs that we have. And try to look in there, and maybe that will just spark an idea of something more clear that you needed. But try to look in there and identify, what did I feel that wasn't great? What did I need instead in the situation? Because remember, so much of what boundaries are the authentic expression of your feelings and needs that allow you to join more honestly and deeply with others. Okay? So just a few other examples. You know, you might realize, okay, somebody showed up unannounced to my home this morning. Maybe it was your in-laws, and maybe you felt frustration or anxiety. So you would circle, okay, I feel frustration or anxiety when this happened. What did I need? Oh, I needed them to call ahead next time. Okay, so really simple exercise, but honestly, usually very new to many people. And I imagine many people who are taking this course right now as well, you haven't necessarily been taught to think in this way. So ask yourself, maybe it was somebody who borrowed something and didn't give it back or made a comment that was hurtful. You know, what did it make you feel? What was the emotion connected to it? And what did you need instead to happen, or what do you need to feel better? Maybe you need to go to the person and say, please don't communicate with me like that anymore. It's not acceptable to use derogatory names or derogatory sentences, you know, whatever it is. Maybe you have to set a boundary in that way. Okay, but just get clear first, like in order to really work the boundary process that we're going to go through in a little bit, you need to first start to get an awareness of what your boundaries are, what feeling imprints a boundary violation creates, and what you need to happen instead in some of these circumstances. Okay, now what's common is that individuals with poor boundaries often set boundaries out of desperation, aggression, or anger, and this is not healthy boundary setting. This is toxic boundary setting. And I like to call this the poor boundary cycle. And this is what happens when we don't have boundaries. We either learn to internalize our feelings like crazy, and that just builds resentment over time, or we internalize our feelings for a certain period of time until it's a volcano waiting to erupt, and then we act through our boundaries out of anger, aggression, fear, desperation, these sorts of things. And so there's no, in the poor boundary setting cycle, there's no balance and wholeness in the way we assert ourselves. There's a lack of confidence, really, in the ability to assert ourselves. And so what happens is we can only become brave enough to assert ourselves when there's so much anger and frustration that we can explode, or we assert ourselves indirectly through running away, through an avoidance strategy, and asserting the end of a relationship because we didn't feel comfortable and safe asserting ourselves in real time in pockets throughout the relationship dynamic itself. Okay, so let's just say, for example, this is the poor boundary cycle I often see. Maybe you have core beliefs around yourself that you are undeserving of having boundaries, you're unworthy, you're not good enough. Maybe these were some of those pieces of messaging you got from childhood, and so you overcompensate in your relationships. You try too hard, you do too much, and then maybe somebody else has great boundaries that you're doing this with, and it creates resentment, because resentment is often, or conflict is often, a perception of imbalance between two people that leaves one person with unmet needs, right? And so you feel not good enough, so you overcompensate, it creates resentment, and then eventually you blow up or you walk away, and or you avoid completely, right? And let's say you blow up, then you feel guilty for blowing up, or for being angry or being aggressive with how you spoke or communicated. And then because you feel guilty, you then feel not good enough or undeserving again. And in order to relieve yourself of that feeling of being guilty or bad or whatever it might be, you go back to overcompensating, resentment, blow up, feel guilty, and it just becomes cyclical. And I am shocked in my work historically with people at just how common this pattern is. And the other version of it, which often tends to be the more dismissive avoidant version, is feel not good enough, overcompensate, or somebody just violates a boundary, you don't say anything because you're afraid of conflict, and instead you back away instead of blowing up. And then people keep coming in, and you either just end the relationship because you're afraid of the conflict of communicating, or you really create a big wall or barrier between yourself and others in relationships. So you can see, right, like without effective boundary setting, we don't have proper self-care that we're acting in relationships, we're not showing up authentically, there's definitely some form of separating taking place eventually instead of joining. And we are not setting realistic expectations for how we want other people to treat us so that we can feel safe in all of the relationships in our lives. And this is why boundary setting is so important. So in the next module, we're going to go through some of the emotional patterns and core beliefs associated with poor boundaries. And then we're going to talk about how to reprogram them. And then we're really going to dive into the deep boundary work process of identification, communication, and dealing with negotiations. Exercise number 1 is setting boundaries to end compulsive people pleasing and create authentic connections. I want you to think of this exercise as like your boundary inventory and then working to create changes to any patterns that are not serving the highest expression of yourself when it comes to boundaries specifically. And so the purpose is to get insight into which areas of your life are lacking boundaries or where you're violating your own boundaries on autopilot. And then when you define and set these boundaries ahead of time, it will help you to actually have more thriving connections with individuals. So we're going to go through, you're going to check through each of the 7 areas of life in the first exercise, and then write where you think you have boundaries that are violated. And these can be self-boundary violations or other boundary violations. So an example of a self-boundary violation would be, I say yes when I mean no. So I know that I have a boundary. I'm aware that like, no, this doesn't feel good for me, but I do it anyway. So basically at the end point, I am being asked permission. And yet, even though I'm being asked permission, I still say yes. And so it's me violating my own boundary. And other boundary violation is somebody like yells a word at you that's inappropriate and you didn't have a say, you didn't have a chance, or somebody steals something without you knowing, or something, you didn't have a say, and so it's somebody just violating your boundaries and you didn't really get an option or a choice. Okay, in this chart, just write out what comes to mind. Okay, we're not going to go through and do an example for every single one because it would be like a 9-hour webinar, but I'm just going to give you some clear examples, and I'm going to literally go through this with you. So the point here is to write out your examples and then write beside these examples, is this a self-boundary violation or other boundary violation? And in part 2, we're going to then have updated versions of what we would rather do instead, like how we would actually, what boundaries we would want to have and how we can actually enforce those or communicate about them. Okay, so I'm going to fill this first part out with you. So when we look at this, okay, and you have a thought boundary violation in terms of career. So in case these are unclear, let's do them together. So a thought boundary violation in terms of career could be something like, I don't speak up in meetings. Okay, so take a moment. You're in your career, you're in the flow of things at work, and you don't speak up in your meetings. So you have these thoughts or opinions and you repress them. So that would be a really good example of a thought boundary violation from self. And other boundary violation in career could be something like, you do speak up in meetings, but you have somebody who's constantly shooting your ideas down. Okay, so fill out, and they do so in a negative, very disrespectful manner, right? So let's say boss is shooting ideas down. Okay, so I hope this makes sense so far. So then let's look at financial. Maybe you have financial investing opinions and you don't share those with others, okay? Because you think, oh, no, my thoughts and opinions won't be valued here. Or, what if I say the wrong thing? And you have this urge to speak up and you want to share and you want to participate in a conversation, but you actively repress yourself in this area, okay? So that would be an example of that. I'm not going to go through and do self and other for every single one. I'm going to go through a few different areas of life though. Mental, the one I put down is, it's really simple. Don't share personal opinions. Okay, and there's a lot of individuals who will shy away from actually communicating their personal opinions and don't want to speak up and share personal ideas or concepts or beliefs they have because out of, fear of conflict, which can be self-boundary violation. Okay, somebody shoots down, somebody's really negative or rude towards your thoughts, your opinions, your beliefs, the mental faculties of you as a human being. Okay, in a way that feels inappropriate. Now, keep in mind, somebody can be rude and it could not bother you. And you could go, oh, that's just a them problem and they're projecting onto me and it's irrelevant. And in that case, it wouldn't necessarily qualify as a boundary violation. The boundary violations are when we feel like something has been crossed that violates our personal territory or sense of self. Emotional boundaries. Maybe you think too much about caretaking others or others' emotional problems. In that case, clearly a self-boundary violation, okay? Maybe in physical, you are constantly replaying times when people violated your physical space, okay? So somebody did something, you felt like they were too in your physical space, something like that, and you constantly go back and think about it and ruminate without either communicating or doing something about it. And in that case, you're just infiltrating your own emotional territory with these ideas of physical things that happened that are just clogging your clarity, your peace, all these different things. So we're just trying to notice in this part, like in all these different areas, things that show up, okay? Spiritual is pretty self-explanatory. It could be something like not sharing your spiritual opinions and thoughts about things, having somebody be really rude or inconsiderate to your spiritual thoughts and opinions you have, or your religious thoughts and opinions you have. And then relationship as well could be, you're always thinking about Bob leaving you. You're always thinking about what Bob's doing, always thinking about Bob leaving or what he's doing, or, and you're giving all of your thought energy to Bob instead of being here in your own business doing your own life, okay? So these are some examples here. I'm going to do one of a couple more in each of these different columns so you see, and hopefully I'm going slowly enough where you're getting the time in here together to reflect and do all of this. So in terms of emotional boundaries and in your career, maybe you feel guilty for Sally, who is struggling at work, so you take on her work, or maybe you find yourself always giving your emotional energy to her in the workplace, always listening to her fears and her complaining about the boss and about the coworkers, and so you're taking on her emotional burdens in the workplace, finding yourself in sort of a bind and having difficulty saying no. Or maybe Sally comes and she sits at your desk and she just talks to you nonstop, and she doesn't ask you, hey, do you have a moment to communicate? And she just unloads onto you all the time. And that could be an other boundary violation, but then these are the places we have to be able to practice speaking up and making changes, okay? And this is a really common thing I've seen from many different people. So in terms of emotions and finances, right? A really clear example would be you find yourself taking on the emotional load of somebody around you, worrying about them, and then maybe lending all of your money because you're in a space where you're like, what if they're not okay? What if? And so you're feeling, and then you violate yourself because of those two areas in your life coming together, okay? So we'll just say, lend all of your money. And I mean, obviously somebody's probably not going to lend like the very last cent in their bank account and then not be able to pay their rent or things like this. But like we're trying to get these concepts and ideas of where you might violate your financial boundaries because of like emotional burdens that you're taking on and where these things tend to coalesce, okay? Mental, this is really simple, right? You're incessantly taking on others' feelings. Okay, so you guys are getting like the idea. here very clearly, probably. Okay, and then if we just look at different examples, I won't go through every single column, but let's just look at physical. A really good physical boundaries, like an emotional boundary violation in the physical area of life, is if you find yourself feeling afraid of hurting somebody's feelings, so you let physical space be taken up. Like, it doesn't, we're not talking sexual, we're not saying you have sex when you don't want to have sex or something like that. We're saying physical affection. Maybe you're not ready to like hold hands with somebody in a relationship. Maybe you're not ready to be super affectionate or affectionate in public, but you're afraid of saying no. And so and you're afraid because you're specifically taking on their emotions. And so you allow things to physically progress when you feel uncomfortable. Okay, and I'm just sharing like common things that I've seen many times over the years for different individuals. Okay, so physical boundaries, this should be getting quite self-explanatory at this point. Let's say somebody violates your physical space at work. Okay, maybe they put all of their belongings onto your desk, and that could be another boundary violation. Okay, so put belongings onto your desk, and you're like, hey, like, this is my desk, put your stuff on your desk over there. In terms of material boundaries in career, it could be somebody borrows your stapler and never gives it back, right? So like these little tiny things, and some of these things you might be like, these need to be discussions. Other things you might be like, it doesn't really bother me and it's not that significant. But the point is that you have to take the inventory and do the work and look. And it should feel normal to be able to say to Bob, hey, like, you borrowed my stapler last week, I really need it back. Like, I paid out of pocket for that stapler, I would like it back, please, those are my belongings. Like, you should feel like it's okay and comfortable to have those conversations. And this is why, if we look at part 2, we'll see that there are ways you're going to have like a replacement boundary, and in terms of what you want to say, what you want to take place in these specific scenarios that you've just listed out. And then we're going to do exposure response work around it, where you're actually going to pick the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest things, and then actually start exposing yourself to communicating them, sharing them, working through them. Okay, and just in terms of a time boundary violation, is you giving your time, or somebody taking your time, or putting you in a bind where you like kind of have to say yes without your say, would be another violation. Or you saying yes to things when you really mean no. So let's just say time boundaries in career. Maybe you're helping somebody else build their career when you're already falling behind in your stuff. And it might not be in your career stuff, it could be in your family stuff, right? It could be that you want to spend more time with family and you feel like you're never getting enough time with your kids, and then you find yourself helping somebody else build their career in the career area of life, or helping somebody manage their money in the money area of life, or helping somebody with their mental or emotional challenges in those areas of life. So you're seeing that you're violating your own time boundaries in those areas. And then sexual boundaries obviously are quite self-explanatory from the perspective of, time. If there's a sexual violation in the career, in the workplace, if it's with somebody in the financial area of your life, an accountant, if somebody is violating in any sexual way, touching inappropriately, anything like that, that is pretty self-explanatory as well. So, and obviously, if that's the case, like, you don't just do boundaries work, like you report somebody if they're violating boundaries inappropriately. That goes without saying. So that's our first part. So let's go into the second part of this exercise, and we'll go through some different reframes, okay? You don't speak up in meetings. So like it should be pretty straightforward at this point, right? I don't speak up in meetings. Okay, what do I want in terms of in my career area of my life and my thought boundaries? I would like to practice speaking up in meetings once a week until I feel that it's normal to express my feelings, or sorry, my thoughts and opinions. Okay, so you're having this sort of concept or idea here where like, this is the goal that I would like to have in terms of my boundaries, and here's sort of the strategy that's encompassed within that, like what I can do to reach that point. okay? And there's more space below this exercise on page 5 to actually go through and break these things down into chunks and add strategies and journal these things out further, right? So if you're looking at that, the example would be maybe you go to page 5 and you say, okay, career, and if this is what I'm working on out of my boundaries chart first and foremost, then maybe in the career area of my life, I practice speaking up in the meetings with the people I feel most comfortable with first. Okay, so maybe my meeting that I have on Monday mornings with 4 people, and in that meeting with the 4 people, I know and trust 2 of them really well. The other 2 I know fairly well and I feel relatively comfortable with, so I'm going to speak up a little bit more there first. And then your next set of strategies could be, once I feel like I've mastered that, then I'm going to expand into the meeting with 8 people, and then I'm going to speak up once a week there until I feel more and so basically you're creating these incremental steps of exposure to being able to do this so that you can transition through this process as quickly as possible, okay? And you could even add in there, I practice speaking up in the meeting with 4 people, then 8 people, okay? And then maybe you practice visualization, right? Because remember, your brain likes to be familiar. So maybe you practice visualizing yourself speaking up and what that looks like, and then you try to lace in positive feelings with it. Like, I feel courageous, I feel empowered when I visualize myself speaking up with everybody and participating and sharing my ideas and thoughts, okay? So you go through, you would do this for all of the boundaries specifically that you want to focus on the most, okay? Now, my advice to you as well would be to pick 1 or 2 major commitments you can make every week and stay on top of them. The more we do that, the easier it becomes, because our subconscious mind is like, okay, this is habitual, and this becomes part of our new identity when we continue to repeat this over time, feel good about it, and lace those thoughts and feelings together to have that outcome or output, okay? And let's do one more example in this exercise in terms of a reframe. Let's say in terms of your material boundaries, okay? And let's say in your workplace, somebody borrows your stapler. I guess it's everybody's probably working from home right now, but let's say somebody borrows your stapler or your documents or whatever it might be, and they don't give them back. Maybe you just have a system in place where you say, I commit to asking for my belongings back each and every time someone borrows them. And then when you look at the strategy part of this exercise at the top of page 5, you might just say, okay, so for career and materials, okay, you might say, I will write out ahead of time how I will phrase this to make it easier on myself, okay? So you're supporting yourself in the process. So for example, maybe you have like a tagline that you memorize where somebody borrows something and you say, hey, no problem, but I notice sometimes in the office I don't get my stuff back, so please make sure you return it. And you just have something in the back of your mind that's preparing you ahead of time so that you set yourself up for success, okay? And you're just being conscious and intentional. And it would be completely okay to be going through this experience and to go through this process and to trip up on your words and to not say it perfectly sometimes or forget to say it. And that's all completely okay. Back to the drawing board, try again the next time. And just as long as you were taking little steps forward, you're going to look back guaranteed at some point in your life and be like, wow, I'm a different person in this area when it comes to boundaries because I committed to just taking incremental steps forward, constantly building momentum, not, beating myself up if there was a problem or a challenge, and I kept going along and growing and expanding. And so that is the goal, and that's absolutely the way that I would try to approach this entire dynamic and exercise.
35, 40 minutes